There's a shift that happens inside an avoidant that nobody warns you about. It doesn't come when you beg. It doesn't come when you cry, or when you reach out at 2 a.m, or when you leave a message they never return. It comes later. It comes in the quiet. It comes the moment they realize the one thing they never actually prepared for, that you stopped. Not because you gave up, not because you found someone else, not because you decided they weren't worth it, but because something inside you finally got tired of fighting for a person who kept retreating every time you got close. And the moment that shift happened in you, something happened in them too. Something they're not going to name, something they're not going to announce, something that arrived quietly, like fog, and now sits in the room of them that used to feel clear. This is what that looks like, and what comes after. When an avoidant pulls away, they do it with a specific expectation buried inside the exit. They expect pursuit, they expect the texts, they expect the checking in, the circling back, the quiet desperation that keeps them at the center of someone else's emotional orbit. That expectation isn't always conscious. They don't sit down and calculate it. But it's there, underneath the withdrawal, underneath the silence, underneath the walls they build and maintain with exhausting precision. There's an assumption that the person who loved them will keep trying, because that's how it's always worked, not just with you, with everyone who ever got close to an avoidant. The pattern is almost predictable once you understand it from the inside. They pull back. The other person chases. The distance widens. The chasing intensifies. And the avoidant gets to remain exactly where they're most comfortable, just out of reach, never fully in, never fully out, sustained by the evidence that someone still wants them without ever having to risk wanting back. That arrangement has a name in attachment research. It's called the anxious avoidant trap, and it doesn't just hurt the person chasing, it stunts the person retreating. Because an avoidant who is consistently pursued never has to face the truth of what their withdrawal costs them. They never have to sit with the silence long enough to feel what it actually means. They never have to ask themselves the harder question: what happens if I lose this person? Because the person always comes back, until you didn't. When you stopped reaching out, something broke in the architecture of their world. Not dramatically, not all at once, more like a quiet crack in a foundation that looks solid from the outside. They noticed your absence the way you notice a sound that disappears mid-sentence. Suddenly, the silence has a different quality. Suddenly, the space they created doesn't feel like relief. It feels like something else, something closer to loss, something that sits in the chest in a way they haven't let themselves feel in a long time. They may not have words for it immediately. Avoidants tend to feel things laterally, through the body, rather than through conscious awareness. There's a restlessness where stillness used to be, a checking of a phone that isn't lighting up the way it used to, a thought that arrives at odd moments, during the workday, just before sleep, in the middle of a conversation with someone else. That has your name in it and no clean resolution. The mind circling back to you, not because it decided to, but because it can't quite stop. That circling is the beginning of what comes next. And what comes next is a series of tests. There are specific behaviors an avoidant reaches for when they realize you've stopped chasing. They are not random. They are not accidents. Each one is designed, whether consciously or not, to pull you back into the orbit they claim to not want you in. Understanding them isn't about building resentment or cataloging grievances. It's about seeing clearly so that you can respond to what is actually happening rather than to what it looks like from the surface. The first thing they do is reappear with something small, not an apology, not a real reach, not anything that requires them to be emotionally exposed or vulnerable. It will be something low stakes and deniable, a meme that reminded them of you, a memory they have some pretext for sharing, a question they could have asked anyone else but chose to ask you, a comment on something you posted that's just ambiguous enough to mean nothing if you take it at face value. They're testing the water temperature before they decide whether to step in. They need to know if you're still there. They need to know if you'll respond. And they need to do it in a way that doesn't cost them anything if you don't. This is not reconciliation. This is reconnaissance. What you feel when it happens is important to understand, because it will feel like hope. It will feel like the opening you've been waiting for. Your nervous system has been wired toward this person for weeks or months or possibly years. And the moment they reach out, even with something meaningless, the whole system lights up. That feeling is real. But what it's responding to isn't connection. It's the possibility of connection. And that's a distinction your heart will fight hard against accepting. The nervous system doesn't distinguish between genuine closeness and the signal that closeness might be available. It responds to both with the same urgency, the same warmth, the same exhale of relief that says the waiting is over. This is not a flaw in you. It is the architecture of attachment. The system was designed to pull toward the familiar. But familiar is not the same as good, and relief is not the same as safety. You are allowed to feel the warmth of their reach and still hold the part of you that remembers what it costs to be here. The second thing they do is create proximity without commitment. They'll start showing up in your world with a frequency that wasn't there before. They won't name what they're doing. They'll keep it undefined. They want to be near you again, but they don't want to pay the admission price of admitting that openly. So they engineer situations where closeness just happens, where running into you is coincidence, where liking your photo is reflex, where replying to your story is just being friendly. Nothing to read into, nothing requiring acknowledgement, just presence, offered without claim, deniable at any moment, and they'll watch how you respond to it. Every single one of these moves is a test. They're watching how you respond. They're measuring your reaction against what it used to be. If you used to respond with warmth and immediacy, they'll notice if that changes. If you used to be the one who leaned in first, they'll feel it when you don't. They're calibrating. They're gathering information. Because what they've lost, what your silence has taken from them, is certainty. They used to know exactly where you stood. You stood right there, in the place they put you, waiting. And now they don't know. And that uncertainty is doing something to them they weren't prepared for. Avoidants are extraordinarily uncomfortable with uncertainty about attachment. This is one of the most misunderstood things about their psychology. People assume avoidants don't care about connection. That assumption is wrong. They care deeply. What they fear is needing connection. What they've learned from experiences earlier than they can probably articulate is that needing someone is dangerous. That leaning on someone means exposure. That exposure leads to rejection or abandonment or engulfment. And so the entire system gets organized around one goal. Stay close enough to feel safe, but never close enough to feel vulnerable. That's not coldness. That's survival. For many avoidants, the emotional shutdown began before they had the language for it. In environments where emotional expression was punished, dismissed, or met with unpredictability, the nervous system learned a specific adaptation. Don't need. If you don't need, you can't be disappointed. If you don't lean in, you can't fall. If you keep the walls up, nothing can get through that will hurt you. That adaptation made sense in the place it was born. The tragedy is that it follows the person into every relationship they try to build, long after the original danger is past. The walls stay up not because the threat is still there, but because the nervous system never received the message that it was safe to let them down. Understanding this doesn't mean excusing the behavior. It means seeing it clearly, because when you see it clearly, you stop taking it personally in the way that grinds down your sense of worth. Their retreat was never a verdict on your value. It was the expression of a wound that existed before you ever arrived. When you stop chasing, you disrupt the safety of that arrangement. They were close enough to feel the warmth of your attachment without having to risk their own. And now, that warmth is less available. Now, they're the one reaching towards someone who isn't as predictable as they used to be. And something ancient and uncomfortable wakes up in them in response. Something that knows what it's like to want someone and not be sure they want you back. That feeling is not familiar to the avoidant in a comfortable way. It's familiar the way early pain is familiar. It echoes something that was there a long time ago, and the echoing is what makes it feel so disorienting, so urgent, so much louder inside them than they expected anything to feel. The third test is the emotional conversation that doesn't go anywhere. They'll initiate something that feels like depth, a late-night message about something heavy, a confession about how things have been hard lately, a reaching out that has real emotional weight to it. Something you've been waiting for, something that sounds like the real version of them, the one you always believed was in there, finally coming to the surface. And you'll think, finally something real. But watch what happens next. They open the door and then close it before you can walk through. They bring you to the edge of real conversation, and then they deflect. Make a joke, change the subject, go quiet for 3 days. They disappear again, just when the conversation was getting somewhere. Not because they don't feel anything, but because the vulnerability of feeling it in the presence of another person triggers the same mechanism that has been triggering since before they can remember. The moment the emotional ground gets soft, the retreat happens almost reflexively. They don't always know they're doing it. They just feel something inside say, too much, and the door closes before they've consciously decided to close it. What they're testing here is whether you'll tolerate the cycle, whether you'll accept the breadcrumb conversation as proof that something real is possible, whether the hope it creates will be enough to pull you back into the old dynamic. You leaning in, them stepping back, the whole architecture rebuilt on the same unstable foundation it always had, sustained again by the almost closeness that never quite arrives. This is the most critical moment in the whole process, because it's the one that looks most like what you actually want, the conversation that almost goes somewhere, the reach that almost becomes something, the proximity that almost turns into genuine presence. Each of these almost moments is felt acutely by someone who has been waiting and grieving and hoping. And they are used, not with cruelty, but effectively, to keep you in a holding pattern that never resolves. When you recognize this for what it is, something shifts in how you hold it. Not with coldness, not with cruelty, but with clarity. You can feel the weight of what they're reaching for without letting it pull you back into a place that hurt you. That capacity to hold someone with compassion and still hold your own ground is not something that comes easily. It is built from all the work you did while they were pulling away, from every time you chose yourself in the silence, from every time you sat with the grief of it and didn't reach for your phone. That work shows up now, not as hardness, as groundedness. The fourth test is the one that feels like a push. They'll do something that seems designed to provoke a reaction from you, not always dramatically. Sometimes it's subtle, a comment that stings a little, a mention of someone else that lands in a specific way, a pointed silence where warmth used to be, a decision they make that they know you'll hear about, delivered without explanation. They're testing whether the old emotional connection is still live, whether they can still reach into you and feel something respond, whether you're still paying attention to them, even in the absence of direct contact. This is not conscious cruelty, but it has a real impact regardless of the intent. And the response they're looking for, the hurt, the reaction, the evidence that you still feel it, is itself a form of intimacy they're not ready to claim outright. They want proof that they matter to you. They want it without having to ask for it openly. So they create the conditions for it to surface involuntarily. If you react, they have their answer. You're still in it. You're still reachable, and the certainty that brings them, temporary though it is, gives them enough breathing room to retreat again without the full weight of loss pressing down on them. If you don't react, the uncertainty deepens, and from within that deepened uncertainty, something they rarely feel begins to stir, a reckoning, a moment where the comfortable logic of withdrawal stops feeling like freedom and starts feeling like consequence. The fifth test is the one most people miss. It comes dressed as vulnerability, a moment of genuine openness that is real enough to feel like a breakthrough, something they haven't shared before, something that requires trust to say. And for a moment, you're not sure if this is another test or the thing itself, not sure if the wall is actually coming down or just leaning at a different angle. Here's how you tell the difference. Genuine opening looks different in its aftermath. When someone is truly moving toward vulnerability, the conversation doesn't collapse on itself. They don't vanish. They don't make a joke that nullifies everything that was just shared. They sit in what they said, even if awkwardly, even if imperfectly. They follow up, not necessarily immediately, not without stumbling, but with some thread of continuity that says, I'm still here. In this, with you. You can feel the difference between a person who opened a door and a person who only cracked it far enough to check if the room was still lit. The crack and close is a test. The open and stay, however imperfect, is something else entirely. What's underneath all of this is worth understanding without judgment. An avoidant who starts testing after you stop chasing is an avoidant who is feeling something they typically protect themselves from feeling. Loss, desire, uncertainty. The sense that something they took for granted has shifted beyond their control. These are not comfortable states for someone whose entire psychological architecture is built around self-sufficiency and emotional distance. When those feelings surface, the avoidant does what they've always done. They approach and then retreat. They test instead of commit. They reach with one hand and hold back with the other. This is not a sign that they're broken beyond repair. It is a sign that they're afraid. And fear, unlike indifference, is at least an opening, but it's a narrow one, because fear is not the same as readiness. Someone feeling something for you is not the same as someone being willing to act on it in a way that actually changes anything. People can feel lost without you and still not be capable of being what you need. They can miss you genuinely and still return to the same patterns the moment real closeness becomes available again. Feeling and functioning are different categories. And what you need, what you deserve, is someone who can close the gap between the two. Avoidants who have not done the internal work tend to cycle. The absence of chasing creates anxiety in them. The anxiety creates reaching. The reaching creates hope in you. The hope creates a response. The response gives them certainty. The certainty removes the anxiety. The anxiety removal removes the motivation to change, and the distance opens again. That cycle is not inevitable, but something has to interrupt it, something more than your restraint. The avoidant has to do their own internal work, has to sit with the discomfort long enough to get curious about it instead of fleeing from it, has to begin asking the questions that matter. Why do I pull away when someone gets close? What am I actually afraid of? What is this pattern costing the people I say I care about? That questioning is rare, but it is possible. And when it begins to happen in someone, it changes the quality of how they move through the world. It changes the quality of how they reach. Your stillness, the stillness you've built by not chasing, is not a tactic. At its best, it is not a manipulation. It is a boundary. It is a reflection of genuine self-respect, which is something the avoidant in your life may have been counting on you to abandon. When you don't abandon it, you're telling them something true about where you've arrived. And what they do with that information will tell you everything. Because here is what an avoidant who is genuinely changing looks like, and it's different from one who is simply adjusting to recapture what they lost. An avoidant who is changing doesn't just test, they try. The gestures have substance. The conversations don't deflect at the last moment. There is a quality of presence to their reaching that's different from reconnaissance. It feels less like circling and more like arriving. They name things, not perfectly, not without discomfort, but they name them. They say something like, I know I've been pulling away, and I've been sitting with why. They show up with some continuity. They don't just appear when the anxiety of loss becomes unbearable, and then vanish again when it eases. They stay. Not perfectly, not without regression, but they stay with a consistency that was not there before. And within that consistency, something builds. Something that didn't exist in the old dynamic, because the old dynamic never required them to actually remain present in a sustained way. That is what real change looks like. Not the announcement of change, not the performance of vulnerability that closes again the moment you respond to it. The staying, the returning, the choosing to remain in the discomfort of connection rather than retreating to the comfort of distance. What you're watching for isn't the test. It's what comes after the test. When the smoke clears and the avoidant has done their circling, when the probing messages have been sent and the deniable proximity has been engineered and the emotional breadcrumbs have been offered, the question isn't whether they still feel something. The question is whether they're willing to do something with what they feel, whether they'll choose the harder, truer path of actually showing up, of naming what they want, of risking the vulnerability that comes with that. That willingness is not something you can create for them. You cannot love someone into readiness. You cannot be patient enough, or understanding enough, or restrained enough to produce in another person the capacity they have not yet built in themselves. That capacity comes from inside them. It comes from the accumulated cost of their own patterns, pressing down on them long enough to create something they cannot ignore. What you can do is stay true to yourself while they find their way there. Or don't. You can be clear about what you need. You can notice the difference between testing and trying. You can receive their reaches without abandoning the clarity you've built. You can be warm without being available in the way you used to be, before you understood what that availability was costing you. And you can trust that the version of yourself that stopped chasing knows something important, knows that your peace is not a bargaining chip, knows that your availability is not the same as your worth, knows that longing for someone who keeps retreating is not the same as being loved by them. There is a grief in that knowledge that deserves to be named. Because this isn't just about strategy. This is about a real person you cared about deeply, who you may still care about, who is sitting inside a pattern they may not fully see. There is something genuinely painful about watching someone you love fail to choose you, not from malice, but from fear. And the most honest truth you can hold is this: you cannot cure their fear. You can only decide how long you're willing to hold space for someone who might, or might not, find the courage to face it. That decision is yours, only yours. When you make it from a place of genuine self-knowledge, rather than hope or desperation, or the need to matter to someone who keeps making you feel like you don't quite, when it comes from that grounded, clear place, whatever you choose will be right, because it will be genuinely yours, not manufactured by their tests, not pulled from you by their silences. Yours, because the love that's worth having isn't held together by one person chasing and the other retreating. It's held together by two people choosing each other in the moments when distance would be easier, when the walls would feel safer, when the retreat would cost less than the stay. You already know what that kind of love looks like. You were the one reaching for it all along. The only question left is whether they're finally ready to reach back. There is one more thing worth saying about this whole process, something that tends to get lost in the analysis of behavior and psychology and what each move means. You have been inside something painful, not abstractly painful, not the kind of pain that's easy to rationalize or reframe or work through quickly, the kind that sits at the center of your life and colors everything else, the kind that makes ordinary moments feel hollow, because the one person you want to share them with is the one person who keeps retreating from being shared with. And you kept going anyway. You kept loving someone through their walls. You kept reaching towards someone who backed away from every reach. You kept believing that underneath the patterns, underneath the withdrawal and the silence and the deactivation, there was a person who was capable of the closeness you were offering. And you were not wrong to believe that. The capacity for closeness is there in the avoidant. It was buried, not removed, stunted, not absent. But believing in someone's capacity is not the same as being their therapist, and hoping for someone's readiness is not the same as receiving their love. And you, however clearly you see them, however compassionately you hold their psychology, however much you understand the fear beneath the distance, you deserve to be someone's first choice, not their test, not their fallback certainty, not their comfortable assumption that you'll be there whenever the anxiety of their own patterns becomes loud enough to make them reach. You deserve to be chosen with the same deliberateness and care that you have offered. That's not an unreasonable expectation. It's not too much to ask. It is the basic grammar of a relationship that actually works. Two people turning toward each other, not one person turning and the other turning away. When the avoidant in your life comes back with their tests and their small reaches and their engineered proximity, you are allowed to receive those things without being pulled back into the orbit of them. You are allowed to feel something and still hold your ground. You are allowed to be glad they reached and still require more than reaching. You are allowed to love someone and also know that love alone, your love, generously given and consistently sustained, is not enough to make them capable of receiving it the way you need. The tests they run will tell you things. The way they respond to your stillness will tell you things. The quality of their reaching, whether it has substance or just reconnaissance behind it, will tell you things. And what those things tell you, you're allowed to actually hear. Not through the filter of what you hope is true, not through the lens of who they are when they're at their best and you're at your most forgiving, through the clear, honest accounting of what they're actually doing and what it's actually costing you to be in the uncertainty of it. Because uncertainty is its own kind of grief. The not knowing is its own kind of loss. And you've been living inside that uncertainty for long enough to know the shape of it, to know how it feels in the morning, to know what it does to your sense of yourself, your trust in your own perceptions, your capacity to feel settled in your own life. You are not obligated to keep living there. If the avoidant chooses, really chooses, to close the gap, if the tests stop and the trying begins, if the reaching has weight and the staying has continuity, that's a story worth staying in. It's not easy. It's not without its struggles, but it's real. And real can be worked with. If the tests just keep coming, if the cycle keeps cycling, if every moment of proximity collapses back into distance, the moment you respond to it with warmth, that's a story too. And that story has an ending that only you can write. The avoidant realized you don't chase anymore. What they do with that realization is the answer you've been waiting for. There's a reason this situation is so hard to navigate. It's not just the love you feel for them, it's the cognitive dissonance of trying to hold two truths at the same time. The truth that they are a person capable of deep feeling, shaped by real pain, doing the best they can with the tools they have. And the truth that their best, right now, without the work they haven't yet done, may not be enough for what you need. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. You can have compassion for their fear and a requirement for their effort. You can understand their psychology and still refuse to be arranged around it indefinitely. You can love them and still choose yourself. That's not contradiction. That's maturity. The most difficult version of this situation is the one where the avoidance testing is accompanied by genuine feeling, where they really do miss you, where the reaching is real, even if the follow-through is absent, where you can feel the sincerity in the small gestures, even as you recognize the pattern they serve, because it means you're not dealing with someone who doesn't care. You're dealing with someone who cares and still can't cross the gap between feeling and action. That kind of love, sincere, limited, fear-constrained, is heartbreaking to sit with, because it's real enough to feel and not enough to hold on to. It's like standing in front of a fire that gives off warmth, but not enough to actually get warm. You can feel it. You're not imagining it. But you're still cold. You are not required to stand there indefinitely waiting for the fire to become something more. The avoidant realized you don't chase anymore. They are sitting with what that means. The tests will come. Most of them already have. And in the silence between those tests and your response, something is being decided, not just by them, by you. What you decide, grounded in who you've become through all of this, will be the truest thing you've done in a long time. Trust that.